Hey, everybody. Welcome to, I think we're all here. Hopefully you can hear me. Hi, I'm Jamal Simmons. Welcome to the Raven Respite for this morning. We are joined by three incredibly powerful people in their own right. I just want to take some time to bring them on. Michael McAfee is the president and CEO of PolicyLink. Stephanie Mash Sykes is the founding executive director of the African American Mayors Association. And then the one and only Rashad Robinson is joining us. He is the executive director of Color of Change PAC. So I want to thank the three of you for being here for this conversation about the agenda for Black America in the next administration.
Absolutely. Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
All right, so I don't want to miss a moment because we got a lot to talk about this morning. We're going to go through some real policy questions, and you guys can frame this your conversation as you want it. And Stephanie, I want to start with you because last night we saw something that I think many of us, certainly, growing up, probably didn't think we'd see it for a long time, and that is the nomination of the first woman of color to be vice president of the United States. So at this moment where we have a pandemic taking place that's disproportionately affecting people of color, we've got people on the streets who are trying to make sure that the criminal justice system does not punish people of color in a way that's undeserved. And at the same time, we've got this historic moment of opportunity for a woman of color to have leadership in the country that we've never seen before. How does that strike you?
It is an amazing moment. I will say I am not a crier. Last night I had my 5-year-old handing me tissues because it is just such a historic moment. And what was so amazing about last night is, we knew it, she gave remarks when she, was nominated by the vice president last week, but she leaned into her Blackness in such an authentic way last night. She talked about being in a sorority. She talked about HBCUs. She talked about systemic racism. And so, that's the conversation we're having this morning. That's the conversation that, all Black Americans are feeling right now. And so I am just so hopeful and inspired by last night in a way that I didn't think I could be through a television, having been to the conventions live. So it is just such a hopeful moment for, Black women, for little girls, for South Asian women and little girls. And we're seeing Black women just rise at levels, across the country, running for office. When I check my social media, I see a mom of 3 young boys running for school board because she wants a better future for her children. And you just see that across the country. So I'm just so inspired by last night. And I hope that momentum can keep going through November.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, it's huge for little girls. I've got a very young daughter. I also have a son who's about 2.5 years old. And we've been reading a book about Kamala like 6 or 7 weeks ago. We started reading it. I guess he heard us talking about this, and he asked to read that book the other night. And he, so my son, and all these little boys, I know you have a son, they're going to grow up in a world where, women of color lead. And it's not
absolutely more than a hashtag.
So Rashad, what do you think? You kind of are at the forefront in the mix of the people who are agitating and pushing for the society to deal with African Americans in a more constructive way. How does it strike you?
Yeah, first of all, I want to just second everything that Stephanie said. She said it beautifully, and there's no reason for me to say it again, and really just appreciate all of the ways in which it really connected at the both emotional level and why it matters on all the other levels. I also think that, organizing and political power matters, and this is also the result of Black women organizing and pushing the party and making demands. It was not inevitable that Kamala Harris would be the vice presidential pick. And I also just want to give some love and shout out to the Black women who did late night conference calls and pulled together organizing committees and push journalists to cover the stories and use and leverage their power in all sorts of ways to talk to the journalists that they were connected to. I just think from that perspective, I think that that's important as well, because sometimes the story could just be that Joe Biden and his campaign picked Kamala Harris and bravo to him, and not the the work that was put in to create the conditions where he had to do it. And yes, he gets credit for doing it, but we don't want to forget the fact that if not for that organizing, we don't know where we would be right now. And so I think all of that, I think, is part of the story, and the story that we need to tell our young people, the story we need to remember for the future. And I think at the same time, recognizing that the present and the visibility is just one piece of the puzzle. And in some ways, just the first step on the road to actually getting the policy, cultural, and political change that actually makes our lives better.
You know, and Michael, Rashad makes a really good point. It's a great historical analogy to, you know, LBJ passing the Civil Rights Act, right? We think about LBJ passing it, but those things would not have occurred were it not for Martin Luther King and John Lewis and Stokely Carmichael and all the people who pushed to make sure that the country would actually address the problems Black people faced. So you sit in a place where policy is kind of what you guys do every day. How do you think you take this moment and move forward with it?
Well, first, I mean, Stephanie said it, to see Black women's power on display. It reaffirmed what I already know, which is Black women have always been leading. To see that brought into the public eye was quite powerful. Before I even get to the policy, there was something that she said that I thought was really profound, because it reminds me of the strength of Black women and how they've held our families together, where she said that we've got to have faith in things that are unseen and to keep walking in that faith. And to me, that is the legacy that we've inherited. This is the revolution that we've inherited. And so when I think about policy, I think that she began to show us a couple of things that are critically important, that we got to own our people. We can't run away from our people. We got to own our Blackness, and it's got to be front and center. And we've got to organize, as Rashad said. This is our moment to step into our power. And if we can hold on to that faith that Kamala summoned in her remarks, that is anchored in our rich history, to me, we will win on equity. We will win on the policy issues that we care about. But this administration has to be different than other administrations, which get carried into office and then don't know our names. You need to say our names starting right now, and it needs to then continue throughout the term of this administration. And that's why the framing of this around the first 100 days is so important, because that's when it needs to happen.
Great, thank you. You know, and I'm a media guy, you guys know that. And I was impressed from the moment she came out the box. Kamala embraced Black women journalists in particular. And the first interviews that she did were with Black women journalists and with Black-led organizations. And I feel like if we're going to take this institutional power, you know, I grew up in Detroit in the era of Coleman Young, and I remember being in Atlanta in college when Maynard Jackson was there. And like, these were people who took government power and they leveraged it in the private sector to make sure that we could extend that political power out into the private market. So I think that's a good place for us to get started on the rest of the conversation. You know, last night we saw when we saw Senator Harris get her nomination, accept her nomination, and we saw Barack Obama speak last night. There was a moment where the President Obama was talking about our democracy and what was at stake. And I think for many of us in the time since the Civil War, which many historians think of as the second founding of the country, and in the 1960s is sort of considered the third founding of the country, when we started to actually enfranchise people who were not white in a really substantive way. It started to feel like with Donald Trump that the foundation of that third founding was crumbling, and so maybe this is a chance to kind of to take that back. And so I want to remind the audience to get into the comments and ask your questions in the comments so we can get started. So Stephanie, as somebody who leads mayors and organizes mayors, I guess, you know, I don't know if you lead mayors is a thing, right? Because the mayors are all their own individual cats. Yeah, but you wrangle them for sure.
Yeah.
help focus.
Right.
You know, tell us about how you see, from somebody who's doing the policy work and the place where those two collide. Tell us how you see this next moment of political activism.
So I think at this moment, what we are seeing that I sit in DC and there's so much focus on what's going on in the halls of Congress. But the truth is that you have to be coordinating with your local government. You have to be organizing on the ground because, COVID response implementation is a local response. Who's handing out the masks? Who's coordinating? In this moment, there is no federal leadership. And for so many of our mayors in the South, they are these blue islands in these red seas, and they have to really, get on the ground and roll up their sleeves and implement the things that they're not getting state or federal guidance for. So I think when, mayors, they are accountable. So there isn't a lot of, let's do a bill that's going to be implemented next year. I mean, whether they get the funding through CARES or HEROES, they are going to have to, be accountable to their community. So that is the framework that we approach all of our policy. And so, the African American Mayors Association and our president, McKinley Price, who is actually an active dentist, has been on the front lines of this dual crisis that's affecting communities on a local, very, detailed level on the local scene. Like whether you are in a large city or a small city, we see across the board that African Americans and Latinos are being disproportionately impacted by the dual crises of COVID and as well as racial injustice. And so we approach our policy work from a lens of racial equity and inclusion. It's not trendy. It is not a 2020 trend. That is what Black leaders have always had to do, because we have to figure out how to bring our communities forward when we're always left behind. And so when we think of HEROES and when we think of CARES and we're thinking about all the federal bills that are going to have this approach that's going to raise up all of the communities, well, our communities were behind. And so we need these local leaders saying, hey, my sales tax revenue has decreased. So this means that I'm not going to be able to implement, trash pickup. I'm not going to be able to have public safety. And my schools, if property taxes are going to go down, our schools were already behind. So local leaders get that. And they have an urgency and sense of accountability that sometimes we don't see in Washington. So I'm just so excited at this moment that there are Black leaders that are mayors of cities of all sizes, and this historic moment of Black women in large cities that we had not seen in years. We had this moment a couple years ago where we were all eyes on Atlanta, and there were headlines that actually said there'll be no more Black mayors. And I know Jamal and I had these conversations. There's not going to be another Black mayor of a city. We're post-racial. We're not going to have any more Black mayors in these large cities. And look at where we are now, and look how important their leadership has been in this moment of these dual crises.
Well, let me just push you on one thing before we get to this. One of the requests on the street is about defunding the police. Some people talk about reimagining policing. How are these mayors taking this request to actually rethink how we police communities of color at this moment where everybody's really focused on the abuses that are taking place?
Right. So I think the main thing is the mayors are getting beyond the hashtag. We understand as, an organization, and as we're advising the mayors, and we have, mayors have a pulse on what the communities are asking for. And, mayors sit at this intersection of having to understand both public safety, but also how do we solve racial injustice? Well, the thing about Black mayors is they have been doing this work. They were convened at tables at the White House under Obama in 2015. So this is a new response. So our organization laid out a roadmap, a blueprint. It's called the Mayor's Peace Pact for Community-Centered Policing. And one of the things we called for was for cities to look at their budgets and to prioritize it in a way that reflects local values. And if you are in a community that can reduce police, presence and pull your budget down, then maybe you're in a community that needs to actually invest in training, invest in aligned items that would, promote community engagement. So when we say defund, it is a hashtag, but what we want in this moment is to have a more just public safety response in our communities, understanding that, some mayors lead communities that aren't urban. Some mayors lead small towns, but they need to understand that there's not a one size fits all, and to really get beyond the hashtags and to bring the community in to those conversations as they're doing reforms.
Rashad, how does that sound to you as you take that in? And I know you interface with a lot of people who are rethinking how we do all this work.
Yeah, I would agree that mayors are. There's like a diversity of perspectives. I just sort of did a forum that the that Mayor Baraka from Newark put together with sort of mayors of Jackson and Compton, and it was just a really sort of great, and Stockton, Mayor Tubbs, and it was really a great conversation. And look, here is the thing. It is a hashtag, but it's a symbol, right? Just like Black Lives Matter is a hashtag, but underneath it, there is a lot. And I want to make sure that we are also not sort of taking away the fact that for a lot of us in the movement, we've worked for years to try to get reforms, impotent reforms that actually did not matter, chokehold reforms that could not be implemented. Watching as the Fraternal Order Police negotiated new contracts and then turn around and march on someone like Kim Foxx, the district attorney in Cook County, and march on her office, according to the Chicago Sun-Times, with 4 white nationalist groups. They take out Kim Foxx's picture and they rub it on their crotch. And then the next day they put on their badges and their uniforms and their guns and they go to protect and serve. We watch as one of the most progressive cities in the country, New York, the Fraternal Order Police stands up and endorses Donald Trump with basically all white members of the FOP in a police force that's probably about 50% people of color. And so the movement has to consistently come to the table with a bunch of reforms that seem not to work. And so I do think that this will be sort of a place in which this idea of representation and this idea of policy change is going to have to be complicated, right? Because, I grew up, just outside of millennial. I grew up at a time where like Ebony came once a month and Jet came once a week. These are actually old behind me from Johnson Publications. I did their first LGBT, back when I was at GLAAD, I did their first LGBT editorial board meeting with Linda Johnson Rice to talk about LGBT issues, and she was amazing and brought all her staff in and really talked about their LGBT coverage and got some pictures, and it was great, and love that, and grew up in a time where Black faces in high places was the sort of like strategy. I would get the magazine living on Eastern Long Island and see people who had achieved, become a new police chief, become the new board chair of a corporation, and that was sort of like this sort of message was sent. But I do think we are coming to some generational challenges on that. And I think that it's going to be good that we all wrestle with this. I sit in focus groups of young people that only really knew from an electoral perspective having a Black president and recognize the limitations of that in terms of actually achieving change. Black Lives Matter started during the time of a Black president. So you will never hear me say representation doesn't matter, but I think we have to complicate these stories, because I do think that what ends up happening is that we don't organize the same on Black people in power, and then we necessarily don't always see the result in the aggregate of the data of it. And so I always wait for like someone to show me the like full report that's like I can like dig into, that says like the Black mayor did these things that the white mayor wouldn't. And sometimes I see it, I do, and sometimes I don't. And what I want us to just be inside of is a story that, for me, the tie goes to the Black person. But I have had to, in all sorts of work around this country, particularly in our district attorney work, have had to support white candidates. Because right now, what's happening in Los Angeles is a perfect example where you have a district attorney whose husband pulled his gun out on protesters, a Black woman DA. And so I just don't want us to be inside of this idea of Black faces and high places, which is absolutely a thing that I grew up with. I want us to be in this idea that I want Black leadership to drive us to the victory line. But if it can't drive us to the victory line, I don't want us to be unafraid to hold Black leaders accountable, because at the end of the result, my job is not to give politicians jobs regardless of their race. My job is to make Black people's lives better. And that's Black lives in sort of all Black lives.
Jamal, can I just push back on that? I will not push back, but just give an example. I mean, I think that, I would never want to imply that having a Black mayor, we all know the phrase, all skin folk are not kinfolk, right? Like we can't just assume that because you're African American, but we have seen results of young Black leaders. Melvin Carter in St. Paul has embedded a social worker into his police department to make sure that when those, calls are going out, we're dealing with the mental health issues. So they bring their, experiences, they bring the perspective of being racially profiled to their leadership office. And I'm just, really encouraged just by there are those millennial mayors. And that's the other dynamic that we're seeing across the country. I mean, Michael Tubbs just turned 30 this week. And so they're bringing that perspective and unique innovation to both invest in the communities, to decrease the challenges that, have called for, wrongly called for increased police presence. But they're investing in those communities, but they're also coming up with the innovative ideas within the current structure by bringing their authentic Blackness and their experience to that office.
I don't disagree. I just don't want us to talk about defund as a hashtag. I think it's important that we sort of recognize that this has been a movement that has sat at the tables. I've been at those meetings with mayors in the Obama White House as we tried to put forward reforms that we just couldn't implement. And so I recognize the complications with defund. I recognize all the ways in which, both from a narrative perspective as a narrative guy, and even from some of the ways in which we have to actually implement it, that it's challenging. But I want to be clear that if we want to end up with less gun violence, we have to recognize that we can't just have more laws about guns. We have to actually reduce the number of guns, and just doing that doesn't actually get us there. And so I want us to just make sure that, as much as I have just a deep level of respect for the mayors who are doing this tough work. Like I said, I just did an event that we co-sponsored with Mayor Baraka. I want us to make sure that we are recognizing both the pain and the aspiration and the hopes and demands of a movement that's not going away, and a movement that's actually tried at many times to support reforms. I testified in front of the President's 21st Century Commission on Policing, and went to the White House many of times, have tried to engage. And, I live in a city where chokeholds are banned, and Eric Garner was chokehold on camera and nothing happened. And so for all of this, I just want us to make sure that we are inside of sort of this story. And I'm not saying that you're not saying that. In fact, I think you are. I just wanted to make sure that we are, as we are talking about this in public ways, that we don't give the opponents, the people on the other side that will never come to the table with results, the sort of language and tools to be able to undermine what I think are demands rooted in people recognizing that change is not going to happen just by cutting around the edges.
Okay, Michael, let's broaden this out a little bit. And I want you can feel free to get in on this. I think this is a good conversation. As you're making policy, for those of us who've been inside of government and been advocates outside of government and in media following it, you're making policy. You've got a lot of things to manage. You've got economic concerns. You've got social concerns, social impact concerns. People have political concerns. How do you think about that balance, and what will help empower a politician who wants to go make change and then shows up in the mayor's office, the governor's office, the presidency, the Oval Office, and finds themselves constrained by other factors? I mean, how do you guys think about that when you're thinking about what policies are pushing?
Well, it speaks to what Stephanie and Rashad are talking about. I mean, the rules of the game have to change. I mean, you saw in Minneapolis where folks did great work to begin to try to reimagine government, and a small commission of folks is holding that work up right now as an example. The more you get into understanding the game of democratic governance, you see a lot of these roadblocks. To me, the issue is around results. This is an accountability moment in this nation. I mean, that's it. It is all about results. And the question is for whom? It's for those Black and brown folks, that 100 million plus in America who are struggling, who are economically insecure. And to me, that's where it starts. We've got to love our people, and we have to center them, and we've got to be accountable for delivering for that population. And it's not just the electeds. It's folks who sit in seats like mine. We could easily sit around and continue to issue reports about the exotic nature of the problem. But that still leaves us not being able to answer one fundamental question: is anyone better off because of all of the privilege, all of the access that Policy Link has? And so that's what the fight is about now. Our jobs has to be to honor that energy in the street by translating it into real action in our institutions. That's the job. And if you don't want to do that job, this is a moment where there are other options for you. You don't actually have to be in these roles. And that is the way we have to see it for Black folks, white folks, whomever, that it is no longer about you. It has never been about you. The problem is that we keep centering individuals. The reality now is we're clear about what the work is. The movement has spoken. If you read the Movement for Black Lives platform, you don't need to go much further than that. And our job now is to honor it and deliver on it.
So, Michael, you tell me from the work you're looking at and what you think, what are the top 2 or 3 or 4 things you think ought to be on that agenda for Black people going forward in the next 3 to 5 years?
Well, I think for one, while there will be,
maybe this is generational.
Yeah, I think while there will be many programmatic things offered up, I think it has to transcend these programs. The federal government needs to become anti-racist. It needs to look at its institutions and figure out how it's intentionally causing harm, and it needs to stop that harm. I mean, imagine if we had an anti-racist lens to really look at what HUD has done. You know, even before it has gotten rid of the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, it never really enforced it anyway. It was just a wink and a nod. It was a piece of paper of a certification. That is a reality. And so you've allowed sanctioned segregation, sanctioned housing discrimination in the name of the federal government. Our institution of government needs to be remade. And there's ways in which we can do that. That's why we are advancing with the Raven Group, this racial equity governing agenda. Because the reality is we can offer up all the programs that we want. A good example is when we offered up Promised Neighborhoods and designed that for the Obama administration. On a good day, that serves 300,000 kids across the country. 14 million plus live in poverty. But it doesn't deal with the design of oppression. It's providing immediate relief in some instances. But our job now is to get to the soul of this nation so that its legal and regulatory framework is changed so that you don't need charity, that people can actually really prosper in this country. That's our job. So to me, the primary task of our government is to actually want to reverse the wrongs that it's done and to do it with its most fundamental tool, the laws and regulations by which it has constructed this elegant design of oppression in this nation.
Stephanie, you work with these politicians who have to balance this. You think there's a desire to get to an anti-racist agenda inside of some of these city halls?
Absolutely. You see cities, I mean, even in my city in Alexandria, there is a chief equity officer. You know, we've been talking about on the corporate level, but we see cities adopting that. I mean, my roots are being a policy committee aide in New Jersey right out of college. And anybody also on the Hill, there's always an appropriations process. Is this law going to cost money? Well, we can add an equity note. Is there an equity analysis on any bill, anything that's going to come and pass? There needs to be a racial equity lens, and not just equity. Are we including folks? Because in my organization, you know, we always talk about technology and the deployment of technology. And is it going to be deployed equally? We see that right now in kids who can't get online for their homework and how they're going to be left behind. Because yes, certain cities have, you know, high-speed internet, but they don't have it in neighborhoods where people look like me and they can't get on. And we see how those policies in this moment. So right, to piggyback off what Michael was saying on housing is been historically problematic. You know, you look at housing prices now, I mean, mortgage rates are extremely low, 2%, right? 2-3%. But if the cost of the house is your starter home, $500,000, the rule of threes means you have to make at least a third to qualify for that mortgage. So you're talking about having a 6-figure salary to get a basic home that you own. And ownership is the only way to combat gentrification, right? Because you can't raise the rent on your own mortgage. But when we buy the block, we can, address those issues. So absolutely, I think in city, you see those equity officers, you see mayors who understand to bring, they have commissioners for African-American outreach, for LGBTQ outreach, and they're bringing the community and really embracing grassroots in this moment, but through a lens of racial equity. But it can be done better, right? All cities don't have the resources, and they're not going to have the resources after the impacts of COVID and how it's going to decimate our city budgets. So all these things that we want, it needs to be an essential line item. It can't be if it's nice, if we have the revenue. We can't heal our communities unless we have these frameworks in place that as we're restoring and healing and, bringing jobs back and doing developmental programs and economic development in our cities, it has to be through a lens of racial equity and inclusion.
We're going to get to questions in the comments section, but I would be remiss, Rashad, if I did not ask you about this, because this is really important work that you're doing. I think people should hear your voice on. Stephanie just talked about technology. You have been all up in the face of some of the biggest technology companies in this country. And, not only do we have to get kids the ability to have devices, go to school at this point, on these devices and be able to have the access to Wi-Fi speeds. But once they get online, they're facing artificial intelligence. They're facing people who are marketing and looking to exploit them and their parents through social media platforms and other technology that I think we are really not privacy concerns. We are really not having the conversation about how this technology is impacting our lives going forward. And I think you're trying to. So I want to hear you talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, this is the technology that has so much potential to bring us into the future can drag us into the past. The social media platforms will tell you that the civil rights laws do not apply to them. They will say that. And so once you start off there, everything else. And so when they do make changes, they are making them in some sort of benevolent sort of way. They're oh, we're making this gesture. And I really appreciate what Stephanie was saying, sort of about all the work that's happening inside of cities. But a lot of that, is absolutely rooted in law. They're trying to meet, written rule change. And if tech platforms that have become so big, Facebook has 2.6 billion users. That's more followers than Christianity. And so it becomes a public square that is, or what they talk about as a public square that's owned by one person. 60% of the shares, chairperson and CEO can make all the decisions. And these are real civil rights issues of our time. We've had to fight Facebook to basically just settle court cases that they were in court fighting, where you could go on and just market housing to white people or just market jobs to men. Literally, these platforms have not been around that long. So this is not like they were doing it in the 70s. They were doing it a couple of years ago. And so, all of the algorithms that corporations use on these platforms to directly market junk food to Black and brown kids and sort of operate around their parents. And, until we get real protections at the federal level and maybe with some big states, we won't get to a point where we actually are able to use these platforms the way we should be able to. And so, we are very much focused on holding these platforms accountable. But the bigger thing for me is that we need written rule change at the policy level, oversight, because we are at a place where these platforms get to dictate the rules of the game. And by dictating the rules of the game, they get to dictate how we get to engage in our economy and how we get to engage in our democracy. And it's only going to get worse. And some platforms may be a little better than others, but all of it is about benevolence at this point until we get the actual rules in place. And so that, is a lot of what we're focused on in terms of these fights. But these fights, I think, for how we think about even appointments, how we think about who's in place, These platforms, and the quick thing I'll say is, right after the COVID, and we all had to if your job was not an essential job that probably before wasn't thought about as essential, and you were privileged enough and lucky enough to work online, you were on many platforms. And right away, we watched as Zoom bombing took over people's gatherings and engagements. And when I talked to the leadership at Zoom after we launched our campaign, they were like, we never imagined folks would be ever sort of come over and want to interrupt someone's gathering. Well, you could probably never imagine that if you designed this whole platform with just a bunch of people who have never had experiences with folks wanting to disrupt their gathering and disrupt their engagements. And so equity is also at the heart of what we have to demand here. And so how do we sort of connect this to places where these companies want tax credits to move in? How do we force them to actually have to deal with diversity? How do we hold them accountable when they are producing products? If you call yourself an engineer in any other place other than Silicon Valley and you build something that hurts someone, you actually are accountable. If you call yourself an architect and you build something that hurts someone, you're accountable. There's certification. The people out in Silicon Valley, mostly white folks and certainly not Black and Latino folks, get to build all sorts of things all the time without any consequences for how they hurt society. And these are all sorts of ways in which we're going to need sort of people with civil rights focus in the sort of positions to help us write the new rules of tech, so that the companies that are creating the societies that we will live in do not create societies that we can't live in.
That's an incredibly important point. And as somebody who's been a tech entrepreneur, spent a little time in this space, I will tell you, it's not just that sometimes people do bad things with these devices or these systems, these services. The services are designed to do what it is they're doing, and people are just taking advantage of how these things are designed. And so, you think about speech, and someone goes in, they want to police a hate group. Well, it's kind of like the government going after drug dealers. Every once in a while, you cart out like a bunch of cocaine, and you tell everybody, like, "Oh, look at us, we busted up a drug ring." But like the drug business is still happening, right? Everywhere.
Absolutely.
Michael, I'm getting questions from the comment section about the next 100 days, 3 months of the next administration, and what are some tangible policies that we should be talking about, that we are pushing on the next administration to begin to focus on?
Well, I mean, if you think about folks who are really enamored with the racial wealth gap right now, imagine how the radical imagination being manifested to forgive student loan debt, to cancel commercial debt, to provide zero interest-free loans to folks to buy homes. You saw a recent article in the New York Times where imagine where corporations really actually discriminated against folks so that we could not buy homes in certain places. Imagine if they made it so that we could at the prices where the original price at the point of discrimination. Those are the types of radical things that you've got to do if you want to close the racial wealth gap. And so to me, this is why this conversation is so important, because you can't just now tell us you care about us. You've allowed this cancer to infect everything. And now you've got to do something really radical to eradicate it. And so these are just a small set of examples. You could actually redo the formula for competitive and entitlement grants so that municipalities are actually rewarded for delivering on results to Black and brown folks versus just getting money based on census data, and then you never actually serve us. This is what it looks like to get into the bones of governments and remake these types of things. These are just some examples.
All right, so you just said a word that I think we should probably talk about. The census. The census. What is happening with the census, which is one of the most important research projects the government does every 10 years?
That's right.
And what should we be doing? Michael, I'll start with you because you mentioned it.
Well, first, it should be as easy as possible to count folks. These basic things in our democracy we shouldn't be debating, like just being able to vote unencumbered. It starts there, but we've got to absolutely get counted, because it dictates everything. Those entitlement dollars that I'm talking about, it's going to dictate how they flow to municipalities. This is why it matters, how we're going to design districts that folks will vote in. It matters. So to me, there is no option. It's just like voting right now. We've got to, in spite of all the hurdles, we've got to figure out how to make it happen. But again, as we go forward, this is the type of stuff that we shouldn't have to be debating. Right? This is an example where this is always on the backs of Black and brown folks. If corporations wanted to be bigger than their statements, imagine if on these two issues of voting and the census, they just said, we're not going to tolerate this type of behavior. And they actually put their money where their mouth is and supported candidates that would take care of this type of issue. This is the problem in this nation, that we're full of statements, but there's so much low-hanging fruit work that you can do, like just have a functioning democracy where people can vote unencumbered. Just being able to count folks without a lot of gamesmanship. If we're going to do this type of work, other folks have to step up now and help Black and brown folks who are, quite frankly, facing insurmountable battles of folks who are waging war with us every day to block our ability to manifest our power.
Stephanie, are you guys as mayors? I mean, this really impacts. Like I said, I grew up in Detroit, and I remember the fights about making sure cities like Detroit got counted equitably in the 80s and 90s. Is this in the early teens? How are the mayors thinking about the census? Are they comfortable with where the process is? Because some of the rumors coming out of the Commerce Department are that the count is not going to be good.
Right, absolutely. And particularly communities that are, not English speaking as their primary language, and communities with houses of multi-generation families and children always get undercounted. But I think, there's a couple things that the mayors are doing, and it's about burning the candle on both ends. They're, ringing the alarm, they're doing the press statements, they're writing the letters, they're talking to the elected officials. I mean, the census reporting time has been cut short. So we're going to be, still demanding the funding and pounding the pavement on that way. But I think locally, there's a lot of innovation that's been happening. So whether it's, partnering with your church, our president actually did a little friendly wager where he offered oysters to the neighboring mayor if they won. And then the other mayor provided some blue crabs. He doesn't want blue crabs and oysters. So to encourage the community participation. So right now is the time to think creatively. And to Michael's point on corporate social responsibility, there's a great article today at USA Today about having more Black executives and Black board members. And when you have those folks, at the table to really think out of the box of not just, let me just write you this check this week. Let's think about holistic systemic change. Let's think about the communities where our headquarters exist. They can put a lot of energy around the census, a lot of energy around the vote, voting and getting out the vote. And so I think it's an important moment, but mayors will be, have an amazing platform to have a roundtable to bring those, executives that are in their backyards to the table, but also grassroots. And there's also an individual responsibility for all of us on this panel and other panels. Are you texting your grandma? Are you texting your cousins? Are you using your platforms and your social media and asking those micro and nano influencers? We're, over indexed on these platforms. So I think there's, a spectrum of things that we can do in this moment, but it's going to take a collective effort of us working together.
Just to pick up off of that, I'm here as spokesperson for the Color of Change PAC, but I also work at this other organization called Color of Change, and I change the PAC sometimes and change the who's paying me, and that other organization.
What do you hear from those folks over at Color of Change?
And what I'm hearing from the folks at Color of Change is their very public work around ourcount.org, and ourcount.org is a platform that, and I'm assuming just a lot of people that are watching have already filled out the systems. You've done it, and now you need tools to help other people do it. And so I'm going to assume, and if I'm assuming that you're wrong, then get it together. But you have already taken the census, and now you need tools. So ourcount.org is tools for engagement to get your friends, family, and neighbors in motion. There's educational material on there about the census and what the census actually provides. If you are a political junkie like me, we did focus groups with Black folks, both in urban and rural communities around the country, to really get at what people who might not necessarily sort of instinctually fill out the census, what type of things were most compelling to folks. And many of the things that were compelling were sort of connected to not political representation, which is, as a political junkie, me, but really was about the services that end up in communities, which also, makes complete sense. We've got PSAs and other things that can be shared that talk that through with friends of the organization like John Legend and Taraji P. Henson. We have a tool called Your Voice that allows for you to create your own video about why the census matters to you. And we've been buying ads with those videos across zip code tracks in communities with people from those actual communities. So if you do one of those videos, and you may likely see your video show up in your community across social media platforms as we work to engage communities around the census. So there's a whole set of tools, a whole set of engagement. There's virtual events that we're doing around the census that really are focused on getting people sort of in motion and together around the census. And so I just want to offer that up as a resource with folks who are probably wondering what they can do to deal with what's happening right now, which is a historic undercount a historic undercount. There was a 2 million undercount in 2010 of children. About 65% of those were children of color, right? It impacts things like Head Start. It impacts things like other service to the community. And that was in the Obama years where they had spent so much money, resource, and put time and energy, had enumerators of color showing up to people's doors that were sort of culturally competent, really doing all the things that I think, to both Michael and Stephanie's points, you get when you can have someone in charge who understands the community, is invested in the community, being heard, counted, and visible. We don't have that now. And so in many ways, it's going to be on us. No one is coming to save us. We've seen time and time again, this administration will let sort of all of the things that were considered old rules just die. The fact of the matter is, it's a change the rules administration, which means that while we may have disagreed with the politics of previous education and housing and urban development secretaries, at least we knew that those people knew something about housing and urban development and education. And so we have to actually be the people to save us, and we have to save ourselves. And so hopefully some of these tools will give you the ability to supercharge that effort. OurCount.org, it's an initiative that we're running, and also really in partnership with a lot of our local partners and communities around the country.
You know, we have been lucky the last, 20 years, because we had Democrats in charge of the census in 2000, and we had Democrats in charge of the census in 2010. This is the first time since 1990 that we've had Republicans in charge. And in the 90s, people had to sue the federal government to get accurate counts after it was over, some of these cities. And so I think, we're going to have to do that again this time. And you got to give, it's dastardly, if I want to give them credit as a positive thing, but Trump and the Republicans seem to understand structural change. They deal with the courts. They're doing with the census. They're doing it even like trying to handle the vote and mail in. They don't go tinker. They go at the structure of the problem so that forward, you can't fix this problem without dealing with the structure later. Rashad, I want to follow up with you on one thing. Everyone else can talk a little bit about the policy. I know we talked about technology with you. We talked about policing. What else is on your agenda for Black America?
I spent a lot of time talking with most of the candidates that were running for president on the Democratic side. We had a podcast called Voting While Black, where we had them come on. And the thing that we did when we had them come on is not talk about the what, right? The list of policy proposals. And yes, there were deep differences, but in some ways I was like, at this point, I'll take a lot of those things, right? I didn't want to talk about the what, I want to talk about the how. And the reason why I want to talk about the how is because the theory of the case of how we actually solve those things is as important as what you say you're going to do, because that's going to tell me how you're going to build power to overcome the entrenched forces that have stood in the way of justice for Black people. I mean, lots of times people will give me lists of policies that we should fight for, and I will say, oh, just that. As if it's not already illegal to kill unarmed Black people.
Right.
And that we're just in some sort of policy fight and a list of demands that America has, that we could be freed and still not be free, that we could get the right to vote on paper and still not be able to vote. And so I very much want to what's on our agenda is this conversation about power, right? And recognizing how are they going to deal with the entrenched forces that stand in the way of change. If you tell me that you're going to deal with tech platforms, but you're completely funded by Mark Zuckerberg and other tough leaders, then I'm now questioning how you're going to actually get that done and how far you're actually going to go. If you're going to tell me that you're going to change policing, but you're taking a whole lot of money from the Fraternal Order of Police, I've got to question how you actually going to get that done. Because the history of this country and the history of our ancestors is not that they were some people that did not understand power or did not have ideas about the fight, that it's hard. It's hard to win. And I want to be invested in movements that recognize that it is hard and that we actually have to put things over the hill and over the line that we're going to have to fight for. And so the thing that's on our agenda, whether it is in this nomination fight, whether it's going to be, hopefully when we win, the nomination fight around appointments, whether it is this effort on the ground right now, where the Color of Change PAC will be running the largest grassroots voter mobilization program. We have about 65,000 to 85,000 volunteers that will all be getting apps on their phones, and cross-tabbing that with the voter file and with their social media and text message list to be able to engage voters at scale. We had this huge sort of vision of having all these big events around the country, and really well with these Black women brunches and all that. That's not happening, and so we had to switch to a technology solution that's going to really allow for us to reach people, engage people. The other thing I will say about this election is we will be fighting an unprecedented amount of misinformation and disinformation. Misinformation is the thing that we know how to fight. Don't show up to the polls if you owe back taxes or something like that. And we know that shows up, and that is something that I think a lot of us have gotten good at. 2016 revealed the beginning of the use of technology to really sort of advance disinformation. And disinformation is going to be a lot trickier. They are pulling on things that are sort of have truth to them, or at least have resonance. And we're going to have to really deal with the fact that our people will be getting all sorts of appeals. We're already seeing it with Kanye West. We're already seeing it with all of these sort of different things that we just can't yell at people back. We just can't tell them that it's untrue. You can't tell someone that when they believe that they should stay home because both parties have treated them poorly. You can't just say, no, that's not true. You have to help people recognize, well, maybe you haven't been treated great by both parties, but there's not false equivalencies. We have to help people understand that staying home is also not the solution. We have to help people understand that we're not trying to tell them that voting is going to solve all their problems. But this is a much more complicated dance. And we recognize that it takes a lie. A lie gets around the story that a lie gets around the world before the truth wakes up in the morning. We will be dealing with that at scale. And the only way I think we counteract that is with trusted messengers, not with like kind of the back and forth on TV and other places. And we're going to be getting our members in motion. And, there's millions of them, and hopefully we'll be ready.
You may be working on this. Yesterday, I talked to Ashley Bryant and Andre Banks at Win Black, and their organization is wewinblack.org. But they are doing an online disinformation combating campaign, and so they're
we're all working together. Are more on the political side. They're working with a lot more of the sort of nonprofits that are C3 related. There's this other organization called Color of Change Education Fund that Andre Banks is the board chair of. So there's definitely good work happening on a lot of places. Yeah.
So you guys can see that interview on This Is FYI on Instagram and Facebook. Michael, we got a question that I just want to put to you because it stems off of what you were saying. Is it possible to have anti-racist policies in a government founded by racist people?
I don't know the answer to that because I don't live in the academy. What I live in is the real world, where I expect that you would stop hurting my people right now. And I expect the government to do that. That's real. That's not philosophical. It's no longer about whether you want to, whether you can. It's about us making you do it. It goes back to what Rashad was saying around power. I'm not trying to have philosophical arguments right now. I'm trying to lead an institution to bring about the results that really matter. Because people don't eat philosophy. They're not housed by philosophy. They're not clothed by it. They're not educated by it. And that's where we get intoxicated sometimes in our own BS. That's not my thing. My thing right now is to actually be as close as possible to the street and say, because they're not philosophizing. Folks on the street are right. Folks on the street are saying, stop putting your knee on my neck. They're saying, educate my kids. It's like in Flint this morning. Stop poisoning them where we have to do a $600 million settlement so my kids don't suffer from lead poisoning. Those are real things. And yes, government can do that. Now, the reality is, as the nation changes, I hope that it gets easier for those of us who have been birthed in this experience of oppression, who are now moving into seats of power, that we will want to do this work. But I'm not delusional. I don't think it's just going to happen. I think folks have to fight about it. And this is, to me, the work of our generation. There's nothing that I think we're talking about right now that we expect that's going to fully happen in the next 100 days. This is generational work. And our institutions have to be set up for the long haul to do this generational work, because no one's just going to give it to us. So the reality for me is, I do expect that our government will stop hurting folks today. And if they don't, then I'm prepared to fight about it. And that means I've got to be willing to risk policy-linked political capital, my own social capital, and we've got to be willing to suffer some loss. And this is why you hear me saying, it is no longer just being intoxicated by what movement leaders, what Black women and others have done to bring this moment to us. It is about us honoring it now by also being willing to suffer a little loss. Loss in service of actually bringing about the liberation that we say we want right now. To me, this has to be your vocation. If this isn't your vocation, you're never going to do the things that we're talking about. So the reality for me is, I don't know what the answer to that question is philosophically, but I know what people are asking me to do. They're asking me to stop the pain and the war against Black folks. And I know that we can make some progress in doing that. And that's why you see us talking about this racial equity governing agenda, taking it up higher, talking about changing the rules of the game, talking about standing in transformative solidarity with folks in the street. That's how we're going to move this work. So for me, I'm past the philosophizing now, because I think the real innovation is with those who are willing to roll up their sleeves and trouble the questions of the day by doing the work. The innovation is actually in doing the work now. It's not in talking about it and philosophizing and debating it. We'll see. We'll settle it up in the street, actually. That's what we're going to settle it up.
Right. Stephanie, to piggyback on Michael's thing, and we're going to close here with you. You worked with people who they have to be practical. He started out talking about that. They have to be practical, which is what he's saying. They got to get they're at the forefront of where government meets humans. But one of the things that I've seen is the economic questions can't be divorced from this, right? And part of the problem that Black people face is our relative economic position in American society. And people just don't think it's in their interest to look out for Black people. And we can argue about the philosophy and the social impact of what people should do. But when conversations get had about where money should be spent, who should be listened to in a room, very often the economic positioning of the people who are asking comes into play. How do we, listen, Robert Smith, the billionaire, has been talking about this 2% solution. How do we change the economic position? How do we use government, is my question to you. How do we use government to help change the economic position of more Black people to be able to take care of and advocate for Black people from a position of power and strength, and not just a position of supplication?
Sure. So, there are a few basic...
It's a small question.
It's a small question, just all the economics philosophies all together. I think that, first thing we need to do is make sure that there is a cross-the-board livable wage, already. So many of us are in jobs that are, hourly jobs, and $7, $8 is not going to make it in this country. You can't buy a home. You can't rent a home on minimum wage. And we have to take a hard look at ourselves and say, do you want someone to have to work 3 jobs when there are jobs available? When these jobs come back online, do you need to have 3 jobs to take care of your family? So that's something that can be done. And if the federal government doesn't have the will to do it, you see cities doing it, you see states doing it. And sometimes those cities have been constrained by their state level, governors to change those minimum wage laws. So that's one thing. Right now we're seeing our, Black businesses under attack. They're talking about 40%. Studies show 40% of our businesses may not come back after this pandemic. You send them a lifeline, which is the PPP paycheck protection loan, and our businesses could not access it because either they didn't have a banking relationship, or we tell re-entering citizens, build a business, be a barber. But then when your business needs to apply for a loan, you having that conviction prevents you from getting that loan. So we have to make sure that as we're implementing these remedies for COVID recovery, because that is what's, at the forefront right now. And as we're doing these packages, there's going to be a third, fourth, fifth, there's been a third, conversation. We need a package that is narrowly tailored to African-American and Latino communities, because our issues are different. We were starting behind. We had lower homeownership rates. We had lower savings rates. We had lower educational attainment rates. Our HBCUs, it's been amazing to see the generous donations to say, 5 institutions of color. However, that pie has to get bigger. Do not take anything away from those schools, but you have to.
Thank you.
There's more schools. There's more schools besides Morehouse, Jamal. Yeah. But all these things need to be, addressed, because not only just from an educational standpoint, so many of those institutions are in communities where they are the primary source of jobs for that community. So we need our own specific legislation and be unapologetic to say this is the recovery for our communities of color. And it's going to look like economics, it's going to look like, wages, it's going to look like housing, it's going to look like jobs programs that also provide funding for reskilling, upskilling. The future of work is now. We were talking about automation a year ago. We weren't talking about the pandemic. But now we don't have those jobs, not just because of robots taking those jobs, but because it's not safe to be in those jobs right now. So we are going to need comprehensive reform, and we're going to need a special attention to our needs as a community going forward.
You just said 40% of Black businesses may not be able to come back after this is over. And what that strikes me as a compliment or a detriment, in the last crisis, in the financial crisis, was the biggest hit to Black wealth because of homeownership.
Yes.
So homeownership 10 years ago, COVID 10 years later, you're right. There's a real need to be focused. So we're gonna have to close, but thank you all for being here. I want to thank the Raven Group for hosting us today. Obviously, we all wish we were having this conversation in person in Milwaukee, so we could then meet up for happy hour later and go back over all the rest of it. I like to pretend that I'm doing all my Zoom calls in hotel ballrooms, and I'm headed to the lobby bar afterwards. So meet me there for a cocktail. But thank you all for being here, and we will see you all soon at the next event.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Everybody.
Pleasure, everybody.
Pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.